The moment I saw the wreckage in my field, I knew exactly who was responsible. My scarecrow, Rusty, lay in shreds, its straw guts spilling across the soil, its wooden limbs snapped like twigs. The hat my grandfather had placed on its head decades ago was nowhere to be found. It wasn't a wild animal, a storm, or some accident. No, this was the work of a two-legged menace with a bad attitude and an even worse haircut. Karen. Now, you might think I'm exaggerating, but if you ever met my neighbor, you'd understand. Karen was the kind of person who believed she had dominion over everything her eyes could see. If she didn't like something, it had to go. Loud children? She'd call the HOA. Someone parking an inch too close to her driveway? The police were on speed dial. And my scarecrow? Apparently, it ruined the neighborhood aesthetic. Her words, not mine. For years, I had tolerated her nonsense. The constant complaints, the glares, the way she treated every minor inconvenience as a personal attack. But this was the final straw, literally. Rusty had been standing in that field since before I was born, a relic of my family's farming tradition. He wasn't just a pile of hay and overalls. He was a guardian of my crops, a symbol of everything my grandfather had built. And Karen had the audacity to destroy him just because she didn't like how he looked. I stood there, staring at the crime scene, my fists clenched at my sides. My dog, Duke, sniffed at the straw piles, probably wondering why his old friend was suddenly gone. The rage in my chest burned hotter than the midday sun. But as furious as I wasn't going to yell or threaten. No, I was going to get even. That's when the idea struck me. It started as a little ember in my mind, then burst into a wildfire of absolute genius. If Karen didn't like my scarecrow, then she was going to love its replacement. In fact, she was going to see herself in it, quite literally. Revenge wasn't just going to be sweet. It was going to be hilarious. I wasted no time getting to work. First, I picked up the remains of Rusty and set them aside. Maybe I could salvage some of the pieces, but I needed something fresh, something bold. I called my best friend, Eddie, a self-proclaimed genius and prankster, and told him everything. It only took a few seconds before he was howling with laughter. "You mean to tell me she snuck onto your property just to murder a scarecrow?" Eddie wheezed through the phone. "Oh, I'm sure she thought she was making a statement," I said. "But if she wants to play this game, I'll make sure she regrets it." "You're thinking of making a scarecrow version of her, aren't you?" "Damn right I am." Silence for a second, then a deep breath. "Jake, that might be the single most glorious idea you've ever had." Eddie showed up an hour later with supplies, stuff we'd gathered over the years from our various harmless pranks. A cheap blonde wig, an old blouse that bore an unfortunate resemblance to one of Karen's wardrobe choices, and a pair of yoga pants. It was perfect. As we worked, I felt the anger start to dissipate, replaced by something much more satisfying. Every stitch, every detail was a masterpiece. I sculpted the face with an exaggerated scowl, furrowed brows, and pursed lips, the exact expression Karen made whenever she saw something she didn't like. Eddie made sure the arms were crossed in that classic disappointed suburban mom pose. By the time we were done, we had created a work of art, a monument to neighborhood pettiness. The sun had just started to set when we hauled our masterpiece into the field. I adjusted the scarecrow's posture, making sure it stood tall and proud, a beacon of passive-aggressive brilliance. Eddie took a step back and whistled. "Jake, I think you've outdone yourself." I crossed my arms and smirked. Let's see what Karen thinks. The next morning, the scream was so loud that birds shot out of the trees in a frenzy. I sipped my coffee on my porch, waiting for the inevitable. Seconds later, Karen stormed into my yard, her face redder than a ripe tomato. "What the hell is that?" she shrieked, pointing an accusatory finger at the field. I followed her gaze, feigning confusion. "Oh, you mean my new scarecrow? Had to replace Rusty after some unfortunate vandalism. That's not a scarecrow. That's, she flailed her arms in disbelief. "That is me. I took a long, slow sip of my coffee before answering. I guess there's a resemblance. Weird how that happened. Karen sputtered, her face contorting through several shades of outrage. You take that thing down right now. I shrugged. Can't do that. Scarecrows are important for keeping crows away. You wouldn't want my crops to suffer, would you? Her jaw clenched so tight I thought she might break her own teeth. I'll call the HOA. You go right ahead, I said cheerfully. It's on my property, and there's no rule against realistic scarecrows. Her eye twitched. Then I'll call the police. For what? Having an exceptionally well-dressed scarecrow? Karen turned on her heel and stomped away, muttering something about lawyers and revenge. As she disappeared into her house, Eddie clapped a hand on my shoulder. That was the most satisfying thing I've ever witnessed, he said. You think she'll try to destroy this one, too? Oh, I'm counting on it, I said with a grin. And when she does, I've got something even better planned. Karen thought this was over. But I knew better. The war had just begun. Karen didn't take defeat lightly. The moment she stormed back into her house, I knew this wasn't over. She was the kind of person who thrived on control, who needed to have the last word, and my scarecrow had thrown her world into chaos. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. By the time the afternoon rolled around, I noticed her peeking through her blinds, watching the scarecrow with the intensity of a hawk stalking its prey. Every time she stepped outside to check her mail or water the plants she never actually took care of, her eyes darted toward the field, her face twisting in frustration. I could see her brain working overtime, trying to figure out her next move. Eddie stopped by later that day, bringing a six-pack and an eagerness to see what would happen next. We sat on the porch, casually sipping our beers while keeping an eye on Karen's house. The sun was just beginning to set when she finally snapped. Karen marched across the yard like she was going into battle, her mouth set in a determined line. She didn't even bother knocking this time. Instead, she planted herself in front of me, hands on her hips, and glared down like she was about to deliver a court summons. "This is harassment," she announced, her voice dripping with righteous indignation. I took another sip of my beer and raised an eyebrow. A scarecrow is harassment? That's a new one. Don't play dumb, Jake, she snapped. You know exactly what you're doing. You made that thing look like me just to humiliate me. Eddie let out a low whistle and muttered, "Gotta say, if the shoe fits." Karen ignored him, her gaze locked on me like a laser. "I demand you take it down. Immediately." I leaned back in my chair, stretching out my legs. "Can't do that, Karen. It's a free country, and I need a scarecrow. After all, the last one mysteriously got destroyed." Her face twitched. She knew I knew. "I'll report you to the Homeowners Association," she threatened. "Go for it," I said with a shrug. "Last I checked, the HOA doesn't have any rules about how a scarecrow should look. Unless you'd like to propose a new amendment? No scarecrows that resemble local residents? I'm sure that'll pass with flying colors." Her nostrils flared. "Then I'll call the police." I smirked. "Let me know what they say when you tell them you're offended by a farm decoration." For a moment she just stood there, fists clenched at her sides, vibrating with rage. Then, without another word, she spun around and marched back home, slamming her door so hard it rattled the windows. Eddie turned to me, shaking his head. "Man, you really know how to push her buttons." I grinned. "She started this. I'm just making sure she regrets it." Karen didn't waste any time trying to get back at me. The next morning, I woke up to find a letter taped to my mailbox, an official-looking document with the HOA's letterhead. Apparently, someone had filed a formal complaint about unauthorized and disruptive decor on my property. I laughed so hard I nearly choked on my coffee. Disruptive decor? A scarecrow? This was peak Karen. Not wanting to give her the satisfaction, I called the HOA myself. The conversation went exactly as I expected. The woman on the phone sounded exhausted, like she had already dealt with Karen one too many times. When I explained the situation, she let out a deep sigh. Mr. Miller, unless your scarecrow is violating an actual rule, which it is not, there's nothing we can do. We've already told Mrs. Harper. She called already? I interrupted, barely able to contain my amusement. Twice, the woman groaned. She's very persistent. I'll bet, I said. So I can keep my scarecrow? As long as it's not breaking any codes. I thanked her and hung up, grinning from ear to ear. The fact that Karen had already lost this battle didn't mean she would give up. No, she was far too stubborn for that. She would escalate, and I had a feeling it was going to be spectacular. That night, I set up a camera near the scarecrow. I had a hunch Karen might try something stupid, and I wanted to be ready for it. Sure enough, around midnight, I caught movement in the distance. Through the dim glow of the moon, I saw her sneaking onto my property, a pair of gardening shears clutched in her hand. I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing. She really was predictable. The moment she got close enough, the motion-activated floodlights kicked on, bathing the field in a blinding white glow. Karen froze, eyes wide like a deer caught in headlights. Then, before she could react, the hidden sprinklers Eddie and I had set up earlier erupted, spraying her with ice-cold water. She let out a high-pitched shriek, stumbling backward as the sprinklers drenched her from head to toe. Her expensive yoga pants clung to her legs, and her carefully styled hair turned into a wet, frizzy mess. I stepped onto the porch, arms crossed. "Well, well, well," I called out. "Out for a midnight stroll, Karen?" She whirled around, her face a mix of shock and fury. "Turn these off," she screeched, flailing her arms against the water. I took my time considering it, rubbing my chin. You know, these sprinklers are automatic. Real high-tech. Can't just turn them off whenever I want. "That's a lie," she spat, wiping water from her eyes. I pretended to think. "All right, you caught me. I could turn them off, but then again, I did just catch someone trespassing on my property. Maybe I should call the police instead?" Her expression shifted from anger to panic in an instant. "You wouldn't," she said, her voice wavering. "Oh, I absolutely would," I said, pulling out my phone. "And you know what? I think they'd be real interested in the security footage I got, too." For the first time ever, Karen looked genuinely speechless. She was trapped, and she knew it. Finally, with one last glare, she turned on her heel and stomped back to her house, dripping water with every step. Eddie, who had been watching the whole thing from behind the door, burst out laughing. "I swear, man, this is the best thing that's ever happened to me," he gasped between fits of laughter. I grinned, watching Karen disappear into her house. "Oh, it's not over yet," I said. "She's not gonna let this go. She'll try something even dumber next time." Eddie wiped a tear from his eye. "I sure hope so." And just like that, the Scarecrow War had officially begun. The rumors started the next day. At first, it was just whispers among the neighborhood kids, little stories passed around like playground gossip. Someone swore they saw the Scarecrow move during the night. Another claimed its head had turned ever so slightly when they weren't looking. By the time evening rolled around, an entire legend had been born. People were saying the Karen Crow was haunted. I didn't start the rumors, but I wasn't about to stop them either. If anything, I played along, throwing in the occasional ominous remark when people asked about it. "Oh, that thing? Yeah, sometimes I hear it rustling when there's no wind," I'd say with a knowing nod. "Strange, isn't it?" The kids would shudder. A couple of superstitious neighbors started avoiding my property altogether. It was beautiful. Karen, on the other hand, was losing her mind. She already hated the Scarecrow, but the rumors took her paranoia to another level. Every time I saw her, she looked a little more exhausted, a little more on edge, like she hadn't slept in days. She avoided looking at the field, but I knew she was hyper-aware of it. If I so much as moved a piece of straw, she'd probably notice. Eddie, of course, thought the whole thing was hilarious. "Dude, you've turned a petty feud into an urban legend," he laughed. "Karen's gonna snap. She already has, I said, watching her through the window. She was standing on her porch, arms crossed, glaring at the scarecrow like it had personally insulted her. Sure enough, things escalated. That night, just like I expected, Karen came back. This time, she was smarter. No obvious weapons, no stomping across the yard in broad daylight. She was dressed in black, clearly thinking she could be sneaky. Unfortunately for her, I had been waiting for this. As soon as she stepped onto my property, I activated the speakers hidden in the field. A low, eerie whisper echoed through the air. "Karen." Karen froze, her head snapping in every direction. I kept my voice distorted and slow. "Why did you destroy me?" She let out a strangled gasp and took a step back, but she wasn't fast enough. Right on cue, Eddie, hidden behind a bush, let out the most horrifying, ghostly wail I had ever heard. Karen shrieked so loudly that Duke, my dog, started barking inside. She turned and bolted, tripping over her own feet as she ran straight into her fence. I nearly lost it right then and there, but I held back, letting the fear do its work. She scrambled up, sprinting back into her house like the devil himself was after her. The next morning, she didn't come outside. I had half expected her to march over again, demanding I take the scarecrow down, but nothing. No angry phone calls, no HOA complaints. She had gone completely silent. By the afternoon, Eddie came over, curious about her reaction. "You think she's okay?" he asked, only half joking. "I think she's questioning everything she's ever believed," I said. But as funny as it was, I knew Karen wouldn't just disappear. She was quiet, sure, but Karen wasn't the type to let things go. She was probably planning something bigger, something more dramatic. And I was right. Around midnight, my cameras picked up movement again. But this time, Karen wasn't alone. She had brought backup. 3 people, all dressed in dark clothing, creeping toward my scarecrow like some kind of cult. I squinted at the screen, recognizing one of the figures. Her husband, Greg, a guy who usually tried to stay out of her drama. The others must have been some of her equally miserable friends. I had to give her credit for commitment. Most people would have given up by now, but not Karen. No, she had assembled a whole operation to destroy the Karen Crow once and for all. I watched as they surrounded the scarecrow, whispering to each other. Greg hesitated, probably wondering if this was really worth whatever hell Karen had put him through to be here. Then, slowly, he reached forward and grabbed the scarecrow's arm. That was his mistake. The moment he pulled, a deafening scream filled the air. Not from me, not from Eddie. This time, it was an actual siren. Karen's group panicked, stumbling over each other as my hidden alarm system went off. The floodlights snapped on, making the whole yard look like a crime scene. And then, as the final touch, the motion-activated animatronic system I had rigged up kicked in. The Karen Crow's head jerked slightly to the side. Karen let out a blood-curdling scream. The group scattered, running in all directions. Greg tripped, nearly face-planting into the dirt before scrambling after his wife. One of the other women flung herself over the fence in pure terror. The last guy gave up completely and just lay on the ground, wheezing from fear. I stepped onto the porch, slowly clapping my hand. "Wow," I called out. "I gotta say, that was even better than I expected." Karen whirled around, her face a mess of horror and fury. "You set us up." I raised an eyebrow. "You trespassed onto my property. Again." "This isn't over," she screamed, backing away. "I'll get you for this." "Sure, Karen," I said. "Let me know how that works out for you." She stormed off, dragging Greg behind her. The others followed, defeated and humiliated. By the next morning, half the neighborhood knew what had happened. The video from my security cameras mysteriously found its way onto social media, spreading like wildfire. Karen's reputation took a nosedive. Suddenly, people weren't scared of her anymore. The HOA stopped taking her calls. The police refused to entertain her endless complaint. Even her friends started avoiding her. She had finally lost. A few weeks later, I noticed the for sale sign in front of her house. It seemed Karen had decided that moving away was better than dealing with the embarrassment of her failure. I couldn't say I was surprised. The day she left, I stood on my porch, watching as the moving truck pulled out of the driveway. She didn't look at me. She didn't wave. She just drove off, leaving behind the wreckage of her own making. Eddie joined me, hands in his pockets. "Think the new neighbors will be as fun?" I smirked, glancing at the field. The Karen Crow still stood tall, a silent reminder of the greatest neighborhood battle ever fought. "If they are," I said, "I've got plenty of ideas."